Hey, Jason,
Hello, Gary.
how you doing?
Oh, swell, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing just okay.
Just okay?
Yeah, wanted to be like you,
Oh, boy.
but I didn't want to stick my finger in a router,
Okay, well,
and
I don't recommend it.
So instead, I combined a vise with a pipe wrench.
A vise with a pipe wrench.
Yeah, it came out pretty good.
That looks like it hurt.
It hurt. Do you know how many times you bump your little finger in a day? I can tell you just exactly how many times you just barely touch something with your finger.
I hear about people that spend years and years of their lives taking dance lessons, and you can learn to dance real fast when you do something like that.
Real fast. I learned to dance real fast. And I didn't bring my Bible; it's in the office, but I have this one. So,
Well,
if I need any help, you'll have to bail me
share.
out.
I can share you with my
One with yours.
yeah.
One thing I forgot to mention to pray for: Tony and Corey are going to Brazil Friday.
Tony and Corey are going to Brazil Friday.
Yeah.
That's a whole nother country.
They were planning 2 years ago to make this trip, and it didn't work out. But Sunset has a school down in it's kind of an aim in Brazil where they train young people down there, and so they're going to go down there and see that. So
Awesome.
I forgot to mention that.
Well, it sounds like a fabulous trip.
Yep. I think it will be.
Oh, look at that. Somebody fetched your Bible for you.
It's been passed through a few hands. Thank you, sir. But they're all clean hands. Holy hands. What are we going to do tonight?
Well, we're going to
Neither one of us was here last week.
That's
to know
right.
where we are.
We're going to pick up where Don left off last week. Thank you to Don for filling in while you were out of town and I was
Incapacitated.
under the COVID.
Yep.
And so he graciously stepped in and kept the barge afloat.
Awesome.
So he tackled chapter 21 and got into chapter 22.
They probably made more progress than we do.
You know, he did better than I do by myself because I never make it through more than a chapter, and sometimes not even that much when I'm by myself.
Although I'm afraid we're going to get through tonight. I don't know what we're going to do with our students if we have extra time.
That's okay. We'll, I don't know, we'll have a pop quiz or something.
Okay, that's a good idea. I like
Okay.
that. Yeah.
So a quick recap, just kind of where we've been over the last couple of weeks, really. Acts chapter 18 is where the third missionary journey starts at the end of Acts chapter 18. Beginning of Acts chapter 18 has Paul in Corinth, and then he returns back to Antioch, and very quickly turnaround. It seems like a very quick turnaround where he decides to go back and strengthen the churches. So at the end of Acts chapter 18, he's back on the road, starting on the third missionary journey. And then most of Acts chapter 19 has Paul in Ephesus sort of serving as a base of operations for about the next 3 years. And he doesn't just stay in Ephesus, completely in the city limits. He kind of does some little side trips, and he sends people out, and they're doing a lot of things over that period of about 3 years. But for about that amount of time, he's kind of in and out of Ephesus. In Acts chapter 20, Paul starts making, there's a big riot at the end of Acts chapter 19, and they decide, okay, it's probably time for us to go on our way and leave the local work to the local people. So he starts kind of a farewell tour, if you will, where he goes around back up through Macedonia, down through Corinth and Athens, I believe, and then visits those churches and also gets collections from them to take back to the church in Jerusalem, who is experiencing some difficulties because of a famine. And we have some of those. Some of that is covered even in like the book of 2 Corinthians, where Paul talks about their generosity and the generosity of the Macedonian churches and those kind of things. So it's kind of contemporary with some of the things that Paul writes about, even in some of the letters that he writes. But in Acts chapter 20, we learn that bonds and afflictions await in verse 23. Of Acts chapter 20. So Paul knows that when he returns to Jerusalem, and he has a goal of reaching there by Pentecost, that when he gets there, bad things are going to happen, and yet he persists with his desire to go back to back to Jerusalem. And then in Acts chapter 21, that journey, they leave Miletus, where he had met with the Ephesian elders, and then they make their way back, or left Troas, and then makes their way back through Miletus, and Cyprus is on the left, and they talk about that part of the journey, and they get back to the kind of the mainland on Tyre and that area, Phoenicia there, and Paul again is making his way towards Jerusalem, and he's receiving more. You know, he talks to Agabus there, who talks about his hands will be bound and those kind of things. So makes his way back to Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem, pretty well immediately once he gets there, faces controversy. The controversy has to do with the reports that Jewish Christians are receiving that are still observing the law, which was their right, which was okay for them as Jewish Christians to still be observing some aspects of the law. But they've been hearing that Paul is out there telling people they don't have to observe the law, and there's just some anxiety there, and there's some trepidation kind of on the part of these Jewish Christians about what's going on. And so they suggest that Paul should go to the temple and spend time at the temple, and then in that process be with some men who are finishing up a vow, and they pay off what they owe of the vow, and Paul is with them to go through that process, demonstrating that he's still supportive of their traditions, of their heritage as Jewish people.
And it does say specifically they accused him or heard that he was telling the Jews among the Gentiles to not do that.
Which he was not doing.
He was not doing that.
Right. So there was misinformation and there was controversy, and Paul is trying to smooth those things over and trying to be a uniter, a peacemaker, and those things by doing what he's doing. So during that process of being at the temple to pay off the vows, some of those Asian Jews who have followed him basically from Ephesus, and they're there because it's Pentecost and they want to observe the feast, and it's not necessarily that they just followed Paul there to make trouble, but they're at the temple, they see Paul, they know who he is, they've lived through the riot in Ephesus, they've heard about the things that have been going on in other places, and they see him there. And earlier in the week they had seen him with Trophimus of Ephesus out and about in the city, who is a Gentile, a known Gentile, and they assume that Paul has brought Trophimus into the temple. Well, he's not there with him now, but why? You know, it's kind of one of those things where they just make an assumption, and based on that assumption, they stir up trouble. Mm-hmm. And a riot ensues. And riots in Jerusalem are a bad thing because the Jews do not gain Roman favor when they stage riots. And so very quickly, the Roman guard that would have been stationed right there at the temple is on the scene, and they grab hold of Paul, and they want to know what's going on. So Paul seeks permission to address the crowd, and that's kind of where we end at Acts chapter 20 or Acts chapter 21 rather, with Paul seeking that permission to address the crowd, and he's given permission to do so. Go ahead.
That is the worst chapter break in all the history of chapter breaks.
Is it the worst?
Yes, it ends with a comma.
Well, yeah, but we've seen some that end with, like, in the middle of a sentence without even a comma, I think.
Could be. It could be. But this chapter 21 ends in a comma.
Yeah. And I agree. But it had been 40 verses since the last chapter break. It's about time for one.
Click the thing. And
it was
make a chapter break.
It was time for one. So it is not a good one. But so Paul begins speaking to them, and he even a few verses before that, the Roman guard basically asks, Paul says, "Can I say something to you?" And he says, "Do you speak Greek?" And Paul is conversing with him in Greek. And then as Paul begins addressing the Hebrew audience, he begins speaking in Hebrew. Mm-hmm. Paul's a smart dude. Yeah, and I know we talk about it sometimes, but I think it's important for us to realize the level of education that we're talking about with Paul. Paul is not just your run-of-the-mill fellow. He is a well-educated, very well-trained classical thinker. He can converse with them in Greek. He converse with them in Hebrew, and he's ready to do what needs to be done. So he begins speaking in Hebrew, and as soon as he does that, the Jews quiet down. Now, how does he garner their respect just by speaking to them in Hebrew?
Well, they're hearing their language,
yeah,
and he's not speaking some other language.
And so but there's just another indication of Paul's brilliance. He knows that he needs to reach a Jewish audience, and he knows he's going to reach them best by speaking to them in their own language. And so he doesn't speak to them in the common language of the day. He speaks to them in their own dialect, and they instantly he has them. He has them as a crowd listening to them. They are quiet, and he's able to offer his defense. So That first part of Acts chapter 21 there, about through the first 15 or 16 verses, Paul gives a retelling of his conversion story, about who he was before his conversion, about his training, about his upbringing, and that he was, given approval by the council, by the high priest, to go and persecute the church, that he was arresting people and those things. And then talks about being on the road to Damascus, seeing the light, hearing the voice, and the people with him saw the light, but they didn't understand what the voice said, and going on into Damascus and meeting Ananias, and who was a man who was approved of by the Jews. He was well spoken of by the people. Even the ones that knew he was going to arrest Christians didn't have anything bad to say about Ananias. And so all that's taking place. And then we pick up with, he says in verse 16, Ananias tells him, why do you delay? Arise, be baptized, wash away your sins, call in his name. So that's the end of our recap. Okay, we're ready to kind of pick up here with the text in verse 17. And you thought we were going to get done early. Okay.
We might mention what we always mention is the calling on the name of the Lord is used 3 times.
Yes.
And that's one of the 3 times.
Yeah.
In Acts chapter 2, it's in connection with baptism, because after Peter says that, the people say, what must we do? And he says, repent and be baptized.
Yeah.
And the other's in Romans chapter 10.
Which also mentions baptism.
It's
there you go.
It's in the whole context of Romans 6 and the rest of Romans 10.
So picking up verse 17, it says, and it came about when I returned to Jerusalem. And this is Paul still giving the recounting of his history. This is Paul telling his story, which kind of fits in with us, what we're doing on Circle Sundays, by the way, with the idea of telling our story.
It is.
And it came about when I returned to Jerusalem that I was praying in the temple, that I fell into a trance, and I saw him saying to me, make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me. And I said, Lord, they themselves understand that in one synagogue after another I used to imprison and beat those who believed in thee. And when the blood of thy witness Stephen was being shed, I also was standing by, approving and watching out for the cloaks of those who were slaying him. And he said to me, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. So after his conversion, Paul goes to Jerusalem, to the temple. And we know that from earlier chapters that we read in the book of Acts, where that's exactly what happens. Paul has his conversion experience in Damascus. He goes back, and Barnabas, it says, was leading him around and introducing him to people and all those things. So Paul goes to the temple, and it's while he's at the temple and he's there praying. And you can imagine a man of Paul's piety and his dedication, what that prayer might have been like, realizing that he had spent part of his life persecuting the church and giving his consent to killing Christians and those things. And so Paul had a lot to pray about. And a lot to converse with the Lord about in regard to those things of his past. And while he's there at the temple, he receives direct instruction from the Lord, a direct revelation from the Lord himself. He recognizes Jesus because he's seen Jesus on the road to Damascus already. And he recognizes this as Jesus, as the Lord. And the Lord tells him, get out of Jerusalem and get out now, because they will not accept you here. You're going to be seen as a traitor. You're a betrayer. Because you have changed teams. But Paul wanted to stay. That is the basic tenor of what he's saying there. But Lord, they know who I am. They know that I went from synagogue to synagogue arresting people. I need to be the one to tell them that this was wrong, that I need to make amends basically for what I was doing before. Paul wanted to stay as a witness for the Lord in Jerusalem, but Jesus tells him, no, you need to leave. You need to get out now. And then specifically says to him there in the context of that prayer in Jerusalem, I will send you far away to the Gentiles. And Paul mentions that, says those words to this Jewish crowd who has been on the verge of riot already because they believe that he's brought a Gentile into the temple. He hasn't, but they believe he has. And now Paul says, oh, by the way, Jesus, the Son of God that you betrayed, that you murdered, that you don't believe in, that I'm preaching you today, he's the one that told me to go to the Gentiles. How does that go?
That ought to pretty much do it.
That gets their attention.
That's the fuse right there.
I think up until he said those words, he had their attention. They were listening. They were hearing him out. They may not have liked some of the things he even said up to that point, but they were still listening. But as soon as he says that, Jesus told me I will send you far away to the Gentiles, here's what happens next. And they listened to him up to this statement. And then they raised their voices and said, away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live. That escalated quickly.
Yeah, way fast.
And as they were crying out and throwing off their cloaks and tossing dust into the air, the commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks, stating that he should be examined by scourging so that he might find out the reason why they were shouting against him that way. And when they stretched him out with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, "Is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned?" And when the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and told him, saying, "What are you about to do? For this man is a Roman." The commander came and said to him, "Tell me, are you a Roman?" And he said, "Yes." The commander answered, "I acquired the citizenship with a large sum of money." And Paul said, "But I was actually born a citizen." Therefore, those who were about to examine him immediately let go of him, and the commander also was afraid when he found out that he was a Roman, and because he had put him in chains. But on the next day, wishing to know for certain why he had been accused by the Jews, he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the council to assemble and brought Paul down and set him before them. So at the mention of the Gentiles, the crowd erupts, and you can just, I'm sure, picture the scene just like I can with the way it describes them throwing off their cloaks, throwing dust in the air, the gnashing of teeth and the epithets and the cursings that are coming forth, and Paul basically, by their count, has forfeited his life. He has committed blasphemy, and thinks that they just want to drag him out of town and kill him. And this goes back even to when if you go back into chapter 21, when they believed that Paul had brought a Gentile into the temple, they clear the temple out, and it says, and they shut the door. Mm-hmm. If a Gentile has entered the temple is now unclean. Mm-hmm. It has to go through ceremonial cleansing before it can be reopened, and business can be conducted there as usual again. So they believe that Paul has committed a grave blasphemy against God by bringing a Gentile into the temple, and they think by saying this he has admitted to doing that. They've assumed it, yeah. Well, and I agree, and I think part of Paul's reason for giving that whole defense that he's given is for them to have some level of understanding of his reverence for the place, because he talks about his upbringing and about who he is as a Pharisee and being trained at the feet of Gamaliel, and he understands the law, and he knows what is right and wrong according to the law. And he would not have done this, even if he believed it would have been okay for a Gentile to enter the temple. He would not have done it out of respect for those that don't believe it. And so Paul there is giving all of that in part because that's his defense of saying, I understand how you guys think. This is not what I would have done. But I also want you to understand that the gospel is different than the law that we grew up under, and the gospel has been opened up to the Gentiles by the Lord who promotes the gospel. And so Paul wants them to understand the differences that he's seeing as well. But they don't see it as being different. And so the crowd erupts. They're on the verge of rioting, and of course the Romans are going to be quick to put a stop to this, because we've talked about it before. Romans they'll put up with a lot of stuff, but they won't put up with rioting. And the commander, who's in charge of making sure there are no riots, can't afford for there to be a riot, because if there's a riot under his watch, he is responsible for that, and he gets disciplined, if not killed, executed by his commander. So he is going to put this down quickly. The Roman commander orders Paul to be examined by scourging, and that, to our way of thinking, that's almost humorous to think that this Roman guard, who has no idea what any of this means. First of all, he doesn't even understand the conversation that's going on, because Paul's been speaking in Hebrew, so he's standing there listening to this whole thing. He hears everything Paul says, but he doesn't understand any of it because he doesn't speak Hebrew. And then all of a sudden the crowd erupts, and he doesn't know what Paul said to them. As far as he knows, Paul may have been giving them a discourse about how to overthrow the Roman government. And so he's ready to strap Paul down and have a conversation with Paul about, all right, we're going to get to the bottom of this, why you caused them to have this riot. So they tie him down. They're about ready to start whipping him. And Paul says, by the way, is this lawful for you to do to a Roman citizen without a trial? And no, it's not. Paul knows the answer to that question. And the centurion knows the answer to that question. The commander knows the answer to that question. It is not. And they had no idea Paul was a Roman citizen. So the commander comes back and asks him, are you really a Roman citizen? And Paul, if I'm strapped down and I think it'll get me out of a whipping, I might say, yeah, I'm a Roman citizen. But what's going to happen to Paul if he's not really a Roman citizen? They find out he's not.
That's bad.
Then he's dead.
Yeah.
He has committed treason then, and he is a dead man. So he can't lie about this. And so yes, I am a Roman citizen. And the commander said, well, I am a citizen too, and I purchased my citizenship with a large amount of money. And Paul said, well, I was born a citizen. He's a natural-born Roman citizen, and he doesn't have to say, well, I purchased mine. And so, so the commander, at that moment, those who are holding him down, those who have hold of the straps that are ready to do they just let go. Well, we're done. We're not doing anything else. And Paul is released. And this changes the whole tenor of the conversation then that they have. The commander says, okay, we're going to get to the bottom of this, but now we're going to call you in as a witness. We're not going to scourge you. We're not going to beat the truth out of you. We're going to call the parties together, and we're going to sit down and talk about it and figure out what's going on. So the commander calls for the chief priests and the council to assemble, and Paul is brought in before them to give an accounting of what's going on.
Which brings us up to
Chapter 23.
Now that's a good chapter break.
That's a good chapter
a good
break.
one.
That take a breath.
Now Paul appears before the council, and I just put Sanhedrin in there because that's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
The Sanhedrin is the council. In the first 6 verses, and Paul, looking intently at the council, said, Brethren, I've lived my life with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day. And the high priest Ananias commanded those standing beside him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. And do you sit to try me according to the law, and in violation of the law order me to be struck? But the bystanders said, Do you revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I was not aware, brethren, that he was high priest, for it is written, You shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. But perceiving that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, Paul began crying out in the council, Brethren, I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. I am on trial for the hope and resurrection of the dead. Paul says, I have lived my life with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day. We'll talk about that. That's a good question. That's an excellent question. That's worthy of discussion.
You're going to make me discuss it, aren't you?
That one, no, you're going to discuss
Those
this.
are usually the ones you throw at me.
You're going to discuss this one, how he could say he'd lived life with a perfect good conscience before God up to this day. When 1 Timothy chapter 1, he said, Thank Christ Jesus our Lord, who has strengthened me because he considered me faithful, putting me into service, even though I was formerly a blasphemer and a persecutor and a violent aggressor. And yet I was shown mercy because I acted ignorantly in unbelief. And the grace of our Lord was more than abundant with the faith and love which are found in Jesus Christ. It is a trustworthy statement, deserving full acceptance, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, among whom I am foremost of all.
I see no problem.
Oh, so how can he say, I live my life with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day? He is the chief of sinners, a blasphemer, a persecutor, and a violent aggressor.
Yes, but once he learned that he was those things, he did what was necessary to change.
Oh,
he didn't live in violation of his conscience. When he learned of things in his life that he was doing that were wrong, he didn't continue doing those things in violation of his conscience. He repented and he made things right.
So can we do things in good conscience and be wrong?
Absolutely. He did those things in ignorance. His conscience was not seared because he didn't know it should be seared.
So if we do things that are wrong because we don't know any better, that's okay.
It is not okay because he was wrong. He was the chief of sinners.
Okay.
But he was shown a more excellent way and made his life right according to that way.
Okay, good. I'm glad to hear that.
We're on the same page.
We're on the same page.
All right.
Because it's not, ignorance is not the defense, but he was shown something, he did it, and so he did everything with a good conscience, which tells us the importance of having a properly trained conscience to be our guide.
Which I think says something about, going back to his whole conversion experience, why was Paul chosen when he was that guy? Well, Paul was an up-and-comer. He was on the fast track to become a member of the Sanhedrin. He was in training to be a council member. And there were those on the council that were there because that's where they wanted to be. They wanted that power. They wanted that station. They wanted to be seen as a ruler of Israel. There are others like Paul who were on that council because they were so devoted to the law and so devoted to God that their zeal for God put them in a position to take that. And I think we even see that with Gamaliel himself, as he's giving in Acts chapter 3 or 4, when he's the one counseling the rest of the council against taking extreme measures against the apostle. Wait and see what happens. If it's from God, then we can't defeat it. If it's not from God, it'll run out of its own course, and we don't have to do anything about it. And Paul was of that stature. He was following God, believed he was following God in everything he did. And once he learned that what he was doing was not following God, he changed his course so that he was following God.
Yeah, and I think you're totally right. He was more the character of Gamaliel than of some of these other, Ananias and some of these others. And he's the kind of person you'd want to have to do the job that Paul did.
Yeah. Because
of his sincerity, of his zeal, his devotion to God. All he wanted to do is what God wanted him to do,
right.
Period. End of story. And that's all he tried to do.
Paul was never seeking power or glory for himself.
He didn't want any of that. He didn't care. And so they said, Ananias had him struck on the mouth, and he said, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. And so the people around him said, do you revile God's high priest? Now notice that the Romans treated Paul according to the law, and when they were getting ready to hit him and found out who he was, they let go, and they did not proceed. Ananias, just out of the blue, just says, hit him on the mouth, because, and Paul points out, you do this in violation of the law. What you're doing is illegal. You can't just hit me without any reason like that. But the people around us turned it on Paul. Do you revile God's high priest? And he said, well, I was not aware that he was God's high priest. I must have two of them that look exactly alike.
You must have.
But earlier in Acts chapter 22, it says in verse 4, I persecuted this way to the death, binding and putting both men and women into prison. And also the high priest and all the council of the elders can testify. From them I also received letters to the brethren, and so forth. And so even in chapter 22, when Paul's being arrested, he said that the high priest and the elders know me.
Mm-hmm.
And back in Acts chapter 9, it says, now Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked for letters from him to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, both men and women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Paul went personally to the high priest. Not only that, but the high priest in any situation would have been dressed differently from everybody else. You would have been able, the common person on the street would have recognized the high priest, because the high priest wanted them to recognize him and honor him as somebody special. And so Paul says, I wasn't aware that he was the high priest, which speaks more probably to the idea that the Romans moved the high priests around as a political matter.
Right.
One year it'd be Annas, one year it'd be Caiaphas, and they moved it around so they didn't have a single leadership that could rebel. Yeah, the high priest would have had special clothing. Yeah, he would have had special clothing that he wore that year because he was the high priest. So, as I say, any person on the street could recognize the high priest just by the way he was dressed. Now, that may have been part of it. Obviously, he didn't qualify as high priest just because of his actions. But I think Paul's just making the observation is how do you know who's high priest? The Romans change it every time you turn around.
Was there a similar account with Jesus saying that maybe I'm just thinking of Paul and thinking of this one account, but it seemed like there was an account at the rest of Jesus when he made a similar statement about not knowing that he was the high priest.
There wasn't. There's a statement, but there's going to Annas first. The moving back before the
because he was
father-in-law.
high priest that year.
Yeah,
it says.
Okay. And so that indicates that those two switched on and off.
It
as high
rotated.
priests.
Yeah,
so that's obvious from Jesus' arrest and trial. And Paul's just making a true statement. Greg. It's possible that I think that Paul had eye problems just from his description of, you would have plucked your eyes out and given them to me, and the effects of that blinding light on him, and so it's possible that he didn't even see who he was. But I think probably he's just making a statement about this guy's qualifications. I wasn't aware that he was high priest. How do you keep track of it without a program? If without a program, how do you keep track of it? Now, by now, Paul knows how much of a fair hearing he's going to get. How much of a fair hearing is Paul going to get? He opens his mouth, makes one statement, and they punch him in the mouth. He knows where this is going to end up. And so Paul does something that may be a little bit uncharacteristic for Paul.
Very shrewd.
Very, very shrewd. He makes a little statement. All he says is, I'm a Pharisee on trial for the hope and resurrection of the dead. Simple enough. It's true. And there were Pharisees in the room, and he just made this observation that I'm a Pharisee and I'm on trial for the hope and resurrection of the dead. And notice even then that connection between hope and salvation, the eternal idea, that it was that hope that he was on trial for. And Jesus is the key to that hope, because Jesus is the only thing that really makes that possible. And so he's making a statement that makes sense to them, but it makes more sense to us because we know who the Messiah is. In verses 7 through 11, then this is what happens once Paul makes that statement. And as he said this, there arose a dissension between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor an angel, nor a spirit. But the Pharisees acknowledge them all. And there arose a great uproar, and some of the scribes of the Pharisaic party stood up and began to argue heatedly, saying, We find nothing wrong with this man. Suppose a spirit or an angel has spoken to him. And as a great dissension was developing, the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them, and ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. And on the night immediately following, the Lord stood at his side and said, Take courage, for as you have solemnly witnessed to my cause at Jerusalem, so you must witness at Rome also. And again, as you point out, the barracks were on the north side of the temple complex, and they were raised up, the kind of up higher where they could actually look down on what was happening in the temple area. And so it took them back up into those barracks. And notice here again, the Lord stands beside him and says, Take courage. And we've seen instances before on his missionary journeys where the Lord would appear to him and say, Don't be afraid. And so he wants Paul to be encouraged, not be afraid of what's going to happen. And Paul has done remember, Jesus appeared to him in the temple at that time and told him what he was going to do. And now he says, okay, you've done that. You've witnessed my cause here finally. And that's what he wanted to do in the beginning. And you've done that, so now you go to Rome. And so God and Jesus want to reassure him to not be afraid. So the assembly now is divided, and they're split almost down the middle, Pharisees and Sadducees. And the Sadducees say there's no resurrection, there's not an angel, there's not a spirit. I don't know exactly what they believe in. There's nothing spiritual there. It's all physical.
Only the here and now.
Only the here and now. But the Pharisees believe in the resurrection. They believe in an angel. They believe in a spirit. And so there's a significant dividing line between those two groups. This is one. Go ahead.
Wasn't it and I may have this backwards, but wasn't the high priesthood was controlled by the Sadducees, but the Pharisees had the dominant seats on the council?
Could be. I'm pretty sure the part about the high priest is true, and that would make sense about the Pharisees. But the main leadership, the high priest, and I think were Sadducees. But it would have been a pretty even split, kind of a balanced split. And there was a great uproar. So we've seen a couple of great uproars when they shut down the temple and dragged Paul out, and then when he was speaking to them and got down to the word Gentile. But the Pharisees pronounced, We find nothing wrong with this man. Now, if we go back and look at Jesus' trial, how many times Jesus was pronounced innocent? I think by Pilate 3 times, by Herod once. He was found innocent. Now, keep track of how many times Paul is found innocent, starting with the Pharisees. The Pharisees say he's innocent, and then we'll get Felix and Festus and Agrippa, And they're all going to say he's innocent. And so throughout this whole thing, Paul is determined to be innocent. I wonder why he ended up going to Rome anyway.
Well, because Jesus said he was going there.
That's where he was supposed to go. And he wanted to go there. He said earlier in his letter to the church in Rome that he wanted to stop by, not in Rome, somewhere in Greece on his way. He was going to stop by on the way to Rome. No, Rome he was going to stop by there on the way to Spain.
Yeah.
So he planned on going there. He just didn't know the Roman government was going to pay for it. And he didn't have to walk. They'd take him and give him transportation and everything. And so he was found innocent several times, but he went because that's where God was sending him. Now the commander's afraid. This is, as you said, they do not tolerate mobs. And now this commander, as you say, is the one in charge, is a chiliarch. Now we know that a centurion is over 100 soldiers. The chiliarch is over 1,000. And so here's the commander of 10 centurions. He is the commander of 1,000 men. And he took him back up to the barracks, and the Lord appears to Paul and says, "Take courage. You've done a good job through Jerusalem, and now you must witness at Rome also." Nothing's happening that Paul didn't know. You went through the times that he said, "I'm going to go to Rome and I'm going to be bound," and all those things. And so it's just going according to plan. In verses 12 through 13, there's a plot organized against Paul. And when it was day, the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves under an oath, saying that they would neither eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. And there were more than 40 who formed this plot. And they came to the chief priests and the elders and said, "We have bound ourselves under a solemn oath to taste nothing until we have killed Paul. Now therefore, you and the council notify the commander to bring him down to you, as though you were going to determine his case by a more thorough investigation. And we, for our part, are ready to slay him before he comes near the place." There is a conspiracy that they will not eat or drink with a solemn oath. That's the greater than sign there.
I see that.
You like that?
More than 40.
Yeah, that's kind of a mathematical
That's it.
symbol type thing.
Yes.
And so more than 40 of them got together and took this oath that they would not eat or drink until they killed Paul. But notice how complicit the council is in this, because the council is just as guilty as they are, because it's the council that's going to set it up. They're accessories before the fact.
Right.
And so these 40 say, okay, what you're going to do is you're going to have them bring Paul in as if you want to find some more things, examine him some more, and on the way we're going to ambush them and we're going to kill them. But the council, in this case probably the Sadducees of the council, are just as guilty as the 40 who take an oath. But the plot is thwarted. This would make a good show on television or something. It's exciting.
It would.
It would be great. But the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, and he came and entered the barracks and told Paul. And Paul called one of the centurions to him and said, "Lead this young man to the commander, for he has something to report to him." So he took him and laid him to the commander and said, "Paul the prisoner called me to him and asked me to lead this young man to you, since he has something to tell you." And the commander took him by the hand and stepping aside, began to inquire of him privately, "What is that you have to report to me? What is it that you have to report to me?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down tomorrow to the council, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more thoroughly about him. So do not listen to them, for more than 40 of them are lying in wait for him, who have bound themselves under a curse not to eat or drink until they slay him. And now they are ready and waiting for the promise from you. Therefore the commander let the young man go, instructing him, 'Tell no one that you have notified me of these things.'" So here's Paul's nephew, conveniently there in Jerusalem.
Isn't it amazing how God puts people in just coincidentally puts them by? Mordecai hears the plot over the king.
Kill the king, and these coincidences are just really
Yeah.
interesting, aren't they? As Jethro Gibbs says, "I don't believe in coincidences." He doesn't believe in coincidences.
Yeah.
I don't either. And so Paul
I don't know
asked
who
the
Jethro Gibbs is.
NCIS. Oh man, you don't watch NCIS
I don't
either,
watch
do you?
NCIS.
Oh man.
I thought. Okay, I didn't know it was a television show reference.
Paul had the centurion take his nephew to the commander, and the commander hears the story, everything that's going on, and he cautions the nephew not to tell anybody. He doesn't want anybody to know that he knows, because that would possibly alert the other people to the fact that the Romans are on guard.
Right.
And so he says, "Thank you. Don't mention it to anybody." And so in verses 23 to 32, Paul is escorted to Caesarea. And the commander called to him 2 of the centurions and said, "Get 200 soldiers ready by the 3rd hour of the night to proceed to Caesarea, with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen. They were also to provide mounts to put Paul on and bring him safely to Felix the governor." And he wrote a letter having this form: "Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. When this man was arrested by the Jews and was about to be slain by them, I came upon them with the troops and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. And wanting to ascertain the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council, and I found him to be accused over questions about their law, but under no accusation deserving death or imprisonment. And when I was informed that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, also instructing his accusers to bring charges against him before you. So the soldiers, in accordance with their orders, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. But the next day, leaving the horsemen to go on with him, they returned to the barracks." The commander sends 2 centurions with their 200 soldiers, plus another 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen. I don't know how many Roman soldiers, hardened Roman soldiers it takes to stop 40 Jews, but I think that'll do it.
That's overkill.
I think that's overkill. He was making sure that 40 not very experienced soldier Jews are not going to stand a chance against 470 Roman soldiers.
Well, and
What's that?
especially starving Jews. They were hungry.
Especially starving.
They were hungry and thirsty
see,
by this
that's
time.
the thing. These guys are still pretty hungry because they didn't get to eat or drink
Yeah.
after this. I wonder if they reneged on their solemn oath. They took a solemn oath they would not eat or drink. There's probably a little clause there, unless the Romans send 470 soldiers, and then we're free.
Well, and this is the commitment of the Roman garrison that's stationed there to demonstrating that they're not going to put up with shenanigans.
No,
you know, this almost riot that you guys had over this fella, we're taking it serious.
Yeah, and this guy's a Roman soldier, a Roman
Yeah.
citizen, and you are not
Yeah.
going to take a Roman soldier under our care. And this pretty much demonstrates it that it's a hopeless cause. He said, "This man was arrested by the Jews." I love this. I just have to love it. "I rescued him, having learned he was a Roman."
Rescued him from the
Yeah.
whipping I was about to give him.
The statement is true, but the timing is a little bit off.
He's fudging the numbers there a little bit.
Well,
yeah.
he learned he was a Roman after. Here he said he rescued him because he knew he was a Roman. He rescued him, and then he learned he was a Roman, and so his timing is a little bit off. But we'll give him credit for that, because he protected Paul. He said he was accused over questions about their law. There was no accusation deserving death or even imprisonment. So Paul's been found innocent twice.
He has a pretty good understanding of what's going on, even though if he doesn't understand the minutia of the law, he understands the situation.
Yes, he does. And so now the Pharisees have pronounced Paul innocent, and the Roman chiliarch in charge of Jerusalem has pronounced him innocent. He said, "When I was informed about a plot against him, then I took this action, and I sent him on to you with all of these soldiers to protect him." And then the last few verses in Acts chapter 23, Paul is received by Felix. When these had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. And when he had read it, he asked from what province he was, and when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, "I will give you a hearing after your accusers arrive also," giving orders for him to be kept in Herod's praetorium. He asked what province he was from, which was a natural thing to ask, what jurisdiction he was from, and he said that he was from Cilicia.
Yeah.
And then he said, I will give you a hearing after your accusers arrive. So we'll wait, and they're supposed to come, and then we'll have a fair hearing. And then he left orders for him to be kept in Herod's praetorium. Now, Herod wasn't there anymore. Herod had built this palace in Caesarea. Herod's long gone. But this isn't exactly the same kind of prison that Paul and Silas were in Philippi. That was a hole in the ground with some bars. This is going to be pretty nice quarters, even in the imprisonment part of Herod's Praetorium. It's not going to be a nasty place to be. It was the governor's official residence, was what it was. It had been built by Herod, but this would have been where Felix lived now. And so, basically, it's right there where Felix lives. I mean, he's not sticking him way in a dungeon somewhere. And so he's showing some deference to Paul. And we'll continue to see that all the way to Jerusalem, the respect that the Romans give to Paul and the deference that they give to him, even when he's in Rome. He's allowed to live in a private quarter with Roman guards. And so far so good for Paul. And Felix says when they get here, then we'll have a trial.
I think his natural-born citizenship carries some weight.
You know it did. That from the time that it was made known that he was a natural-born Roman citizen, they treated him with a certain amount of respect, which shows the value of a Roman citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
That there again, God didn't have to choose someone who was a Roman citizen to do Paul's job. Paul was a Jew, but he happened to be a Jew who was a Roman citizen.
Yep.
And so he had the best of everything. He had the experience with the Jewish system that he could go preach to the Jews, but then he could also go to the Gentiles when they didn't listen. I mean, he was, as you said, he was an up-and-comer in the Jewish leadership. Mm-hmm. He knew all there was to know about Judaism, but he was also a Roman citizen and educated in Greek culture. And so how could you find a better person, especially when you see his humility and his attitude and his zeal and his devotion, dedication.
Right.
He was the best one. Yeah, you didn't talk quite long enough.
Well, we can talk more.
What you got?
Well, Acts chapter 11, verse 49, this is after the resurrection of Lazarus. And so the chief priests, in 47, the chief priests and Pharisees convened a council and were saying, what are we doing? For this man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, all men will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. Mm-hmm. Then verse 49, but a certain one of them, Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all. And that's where he starts talking about, it's expedient for one man to die, mm-hmm. so that the rest of us can be better off.
Yeah.
But Caiaphas,
John 11.
John 11:49. Right. So, but Caiaphas who was high priest that year, and then in John 18, verse 14. Well, verse 12, starting verse 12, John 18:12. So the Roman cohort and the commander and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him, led him to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Now Caiaphas was the one who advised the Jews that it was expedient for one man to die on behalf of the people. So they took him to Annas first because he was Caiaphas's high father-in-law, which, I don't understand how being the father-in-law of the high priest carries any weight, except that I think Annas was like the high priest emeritus at that point. He was the former high priest, so he was kind of the power behind the priesthood at that point. Caiaphas wasn't going to do anything without Annas's approval,
right? Without
his blessing.
Yeah, and he was in this rotation back and forth between the two of them. He just happened to not be that year, but
yeah,
he was in that.
So on the one hand, when Paul says, "Well, I wasn't aware he was the high priest," makes it almost seem like he's out of the loop. But then in the very next breath, with Paul manipulating the council basically the way he does by his shrewd statement about being on trial for the resurrection of the dead, demonstrates how in tune with the behind the machines machinations that he was. I mean, he understood. He knew what he was doing. He lobbed that grenade in there and just sat back and said, "I'm off the hook now." Yeah,
because he wasn't going to get a fair shake. That was obvious. But back there in John 11, it's interesting when what Caiaphas said back then. Jesus he raises a person from the dead, and their response is, "Let's kill him."
Yeah.
But even better in chapter 12, John chapter 12, and verse 10, the chief priests took counsel that they might put Lazarus to death also. So their solution to this is just kill him. Here's someone who was raised from the dead, and someone who raised him from the dead, and they're causing us some problems, so let's just
Kill everybody.
kill him. And that shows you the difference you were talking about before between someone like Gamaliel, who was an honest, sincere person, and the kind of leadership we're looking at here. All they cared about was maintaining their power. And if that meant killing people in the way, then that was no problem. I always give them an F- in logic. This guy's already been raised from the dead once. How would it look if he got raised from the dead twice? So they better do Jesus first, because if they do Lazarus first, Jesus is going to raise him from the dead, and they're going to get egg all over their face.
Yeah.
And so I don't always give them, they would argue with Jesus, and Jesus would be having a conversation with what was going on in their head.
Mm-hmm.
They never understood that Jesus was reading their minds.
Yeah.
They were kind of slow.
Yeah.
Okie dokie, good job of killing most of the rest of the time.
Well,
That's awesome.
I'm good for
I
killing
wonder
time.
next week where we're going to be.
Well, I suppose it would make sense for us to do 24 and 25.
Okay, we're going to be off sequence again, aren't we?
Well,
Because we're
Kinda.
not doing, we need to do,
24, 25, 26, 27, and then 28.
yeah, we need to be odd even.
Where are we going next?
I thought we were going Romans.
Romans is where we're going next. That's right.
Thank you very much.